Calvary Church is dedicated to doctrine, and we want you to experience the life change that comes from knowing God's Word and applying it to your life. So we explain the Bible verse by verse, every chapter, every book. This is Expound.
Turn in your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 18. Way to go. Thank you. So now I know where to go. 2 Samuel chapter 18. In the 19th century, there was a politician in America named Charles Francis Adams. He was very powerful, very influential, very busy, very focused. He had children, but he was just consumed with writing and his political agenda. And he kept a diary. And one day he went fishing with his son, and get this, he wrote in his diary, "Went fishing with my son today, a day wasted." His son, Brooke was his name, also kept a diary. And in that diary it said, "Went fishing with Dad today, the most wonderful day of my life." Now, obviously, there's a disconnect between father and son. The son loved spending time with his father. The father was busy, aloof, distant, and just didn't have time for his son in a meaningful way. We are dealing with, in this story, not just about David, but about David's relationship with his children. We're seeing it in bold relief. Absalom, his son, had murdered his half-brother Amnon because Amnon, had raped Absalom's sister, Tamar. And then he ran out of town, fled and hid. Eventually, he comes back to Jerusalem, but his dad doesn't want to see him. Won't have an audience with him. Finally has an audience with him, but it's too late. Too little, too late. You know the story. We've been covering it on Wednesday night. Absalom stands in front of the gate of the city, wins the people's hearts over, away from David, toward himself. And the coup is on. The rebellion is afoot. In Ephesians, Paul says, "Fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath." I think the way David treated his son Absalom helped Absalom become the person he was. He provoked Absalom to a wrathful, rebellious behavior. Not excusing Absalom, but I'm not excusing David either for the way he mismanaged the issue with his son Absalom. We all have trials in life. We all have storms. But let me make a statement, and I think a lot of you will agree with it. I think the worst storms in life are relational storms, especially in a family. People you see day in and day out that you have disagreements with and hopefully then agreements with. But those kind of storms are very profound. And in any family, the dynamic between children and parent is so crucial. And I'm going to hone in and say the dynamic between father and his sons is so crucial. Because the son is looking up to the father to find out what a father should be like, what a husband should be like. All the different roles that he himself is going to fulfill, he is looking at somebody who modeled it before him. And on top of that, if it's a spiritual environment, a spiritual home, because we are taught to call God our Father in heaven, if the relationship between child and father is lacking, then that is going to have its implications in the spiritual realm. me give you an example. True story. A man was on the street witnessing to somebody. He was a hardened kid he was talking to, a street kid, kind of a ruffian. And this guy was out sharing his faith, sharing the gospel. And so the kid was trying to listen to him, kind of mocked him, not really listening wholeheartedly. But finally, the hardened street kid said to the little evangelist out there, said, "So, you talk about God. What is God like?" And not knowing the kid's background, he said, "Well, God is like your father." The kid put his hand up and said, "Don't tell me any more. I hate my father. And I think my father has always hated me. If God is anything like my old man, I want nothing to do with God." Come to find out, that kid's father had raped his sister and abused the children. So to talk and say God is like your father, to this young man was abhorrent. So David, we know David's background. We know what David did. We also know that David was aloof in dealing with his kids and really not managing the crises well. It gets now transferred in bold relief in the life of Absalom. So Absalom stages a revolt. We know the story that David has fled town. He has crossed the Jordan River. And we finally will bring this part of his life to an end. For in chapter 18, verse 1, "And David numbered the people who were with him and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. Then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab." Remember, Joab is his chief general, his chief military commander. So 1/3 go with him. 1/3 under the hand of Abishai. Abishai is the brother of Joab. Both of them are sons of, it says, Zeruiah. Zeruiah was David's sister. So these are David's nephews. And 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. Funny name. Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, "I also will surely go out with you myself." Now, just a quick word about Ittai the Gittite. You remember him, right, from the story last time. Ittai was, Gittite means somebody from Gath, a resident of the city of Gath. Gath was one of the Philistine cities. He was a Philistine. He was probably a Philistine lord or a Philistine general. And do you remember that David spent some time in Gath, running from King Saul, and he became a vassal ruler of the king of Gath. David took a portion of the land, the southern part of the land, under the Philistines, sort of sided with them for a period of time. No doubt, Ittai from Gath, the Gittite. If you're looking for Bible names, pass up Ittai. But Ittai the Gittite was taken by David, admired David, and left Gath and became aligned with him physically. That is, he moved his family, his residence, and about 600 men who were following Ittai the Gittite from Gath to David in Jerusalem. Now, they got there the day before the rebellion. I'm just refreshing your memory here. A day before, David fled and left town, went up the Mount of Olives and out to the wilderness. So when David is leaving and he looks over and he sees Ittai the Gittite, and he says, "Man, you just got here yesterday from Gath. I'm not going to ask you to come with me. You stay here, man. You've been on the move and you've come to Jerusalem, settle in Jerusalem, but don't come with me." And Ittai the Gittite said, "Wherever you're going, I'm going. Wherever you die, I'll die. I came this far. I didn't come to be with Absalom. I came to be with you." So Ittai the Gittite was with him. And because he was so loyal and because he was so capable, he takes 1/3 of the army of David along with Joab and Abishai. So the strategy is divide and conquer, a very practical and even modern technique in warfare. You divide the troops and you select the different fronts that you're going to do battle on. But notice, David said, I also will surely go out with you myself. I'm going to come to war too. David loved war. He loved it because he was good at it. Now, every now and then I meet soldiers, and I have one in my mind. I won't tell you who it is because you might think weird of him when I tell you who it is. But he was a trained Special Forces sniper for the U.S. government. And he loved war. He loved going to war. He said, I love my job. I never want to stop doing it. I mean, he felt called to be a soldier. I think David felt that way. He felt very at home in the battlefield. So he says, I'm coming too. I'm going to go to war with you guys. But, verse 3, the people answered, you shall not go out. For if we flee away, they will not care about us. Nor if half of us die will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now. For you are now more help to us in the city. You see, David would be what they call in military parlance an HVT, a high-value target. If you take David out, you destabilize the whole army. It is why leaders in battles are sought for destruction. When Putin first invaded Ukraine, he was after, and he had to be, he was after Vladimir say it again? Zelensky. I was going to say Belinsky. Vladimir Zelensky. So Zelensky had to get extra cover and extra protection because that's a high-value target. We will destabilize the country if we take him out. So it is with David. They say, no, you're better if you stay here. So the king said to them, verse 4, whatever seems best to you, I will do. And so the king stood beside the gate, and the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Now, the gate is not the gate of Jerusalem. Remember, David fled Jerusalem. He's crossed over the Jordan, and he is now in a town. I don't expect you to remember all these names, but the town's name is Mahanaim. And Mahanaim, just to refresh your memory, was the town that Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, made his headquarters. He's out of the picture. David has gone over to Mahanaim, and he is, because he secured that as part of his eastern flank, and so they're favorable toward David. That's the city he is in. David is in the gate of that city as the troops go out to battle by hundreds and by thousands. Now the king, verse 5, commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake, and notice how he puts this, with the young man Absalom. Now you will notice, and I'll just bring it up now so we don't have to notice it later, but 4 times in the passage, David will refer to Absalom, the rebel, the murderer, the rebel, the false king, as the young man Absalom. Because in this passage, he is not really dealing with this rebellion like he would a king. He is dealing with this rebellion like a dad would deal with it. And he is both. He is both a father, but he is also the king. And, but the way he's putting it, it's like, oh, he's just a kid. Kids, they get into trouble. They do drugs and they stage a rebellion against you. That's just what kids do. He's young, he's inexperienced. We'll get this ironed up, handshake, hug, we'll get over it. Deal kindly with the young man Absalom. Now, in any other situation, it's like find the person who's staging the coup and get rid of him. But not here. So deal kindly for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave the captain's order concerning Absalom. So the people went out in the field of battle against Israel. And the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. Now, I can't really describe to you what that looks like, though I know what it looks like, but I'm going to try my best. Israel, as I've said on many occasions, is a land of hills and valleys. And some of them are very precipitous, very steep, and very rocky. And this happens to be east of the Jordan River, up north in an area known as Gilead, and it's densely forested. There were no roads, no highways. And so because of the steep terrain and because of the dense woods, it was a dangerous place to hold a battle, as you will see. So he goes to the woods of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 men took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. More people were actually killed by natural phenomenon, by the steep terrain and by the woods and by the uneven ground, the rocks that were there, the precarious situations they would get themselves into, than actually who were killed in battle by spear or by bow. Then Absalom met the servants of David. Verse 9, Absalom rode on a mule. Why a mule? Well, kings do that. The mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree. Some of your translations say oak tree. And his head caught in the terebinth so that he was left hanging between heaven and earth, and the mule which was under him went on. Now a certain man saw it and told Joab, and he said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. This tree, officially known as a Pistacia terebinthus, is a large, sturdy tree found in the Mediterranean regions of the Middle East. And I know you get the picture that he's hanging there by his hair. He very well may have been, but it doesn't say that he was. It just says his head got caught. Actually, his head may have been caught in the fork of two branches. So he's kind of hanging by his neck. His head's caught in it. Or it could be that his hair got caught. We don't know. Josephus, in his book Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 7, does say it was his hair, but that's just a guess. There's no indication in the text that it was. But I'm going to go with the hair thing. Why? Because that was the point of his pride. Do you remember that he weighed his hair every year? And, who weighs their hair? It's like, okay, it's that time of year. I got to weigh my hair. After all, because my hair's awesome. So he weighed his hair, and it was like, 4 to 5 pounds every year, and he'd cut it once a year. And it was such a prideful thing for him, and it could be that, now it became a hang-up to him, quite literally. He's just kind of dangling there on the tree. And a certain man, we're not told whom, but somebody in the army saw it and told Joab. Now, one thing you discover about Joab, you've already discovered it. He was ruthless. He was merciless. You remember what he did to Abner when Abner came down to David and said, David, I'm going to deliver the northern kingdom down to you. And when Joab found out that Abner, the general for the other side, was having a personal meeting with David, he took that very personally and objected to it. And under the guise of, well, you killed my other brother, so I'm going to kill you, he took him out and pretended that it was a peaceful meeting, but in treachery, he killed him. So he tells Joab. Joab is the commander of these forces. So Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him. And why didn't you strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. I'd give you a prize, man. I'd give you 4 ounces of silver, which is 10 shekels. I'd give you like a, WWC belt. I'd give you, some prize for doing it. It'd be a military belt. But the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver. If you were to give me 25 pounds of pure silver, I wouldn't raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise, I would have dealt falsely against my own life. Look, I'm not going to sign my own death warrant by going against the king's wishes. And then I like this. For there is nothing hidden from the king. He knew that David had quite an information network. It's going to get back to David. Can't hide anything from him. He's got ears everywhere. He has loyal people everywhere. There's nothing hidden from the king. I was just reading this morning, and perhaps some of you were reading it as well, Proverbs chapter 5, because of the date that it is. And so I'm reading through, and there in Proverbs 5, verse 21, it says, for the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders or views or weighs all of his goings. It's a good thing to remember that you can't hide anything from the king. That he has the perfect network. He sees everything. He hears everything. He knows everything we think. Nothing is hidden from his eyes, it says in the book of Hebrews. Nothing is hidden from his sight. All things are naked and open before the eyes of him with whom we have to do. So he realizes this on an earthly level. Nothing's hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. So no way, and no thanks. I'm not going to go after him. You heard the king. And Joab said, I can't linger with you. I'm not going to sit and talk to you, you underling. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. He's a sitting duck. Not a fair fight. He's hanging there. He's defenseless. Joab killed him. And 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck him. So they treated him like a piñata, I guess, just hitting him, brutalizing him, and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. All right, Joab should not have done this. Yes, he was an enemy. Yes, he was the chief rebel. Yes, this was a coup. Yes, the kingdom was divided. But he should have obeyed David's orders and left the results to God. That's what he should have done. That's how David lived his life, even with Saul. I'm not going to touch God's anointed. I'm not going to exact vengeance on my enemy. I'm going to leave that to God. He should have obeyed orders. He was under strict orders for the king. Whether they were right or wrong, what was right for Joab is to obey the king. But he didn't. So now Absalom is dead. Joab blew the trumpet. Verse 17, and they took Absalom and cast him into a very large pit in the woods and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, every one to his tent. In the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 21, a rebellious son was to be taken out and stoned and then kept under that pile of stones. So though they didn't stone him to death, burying him in a pit with stones over it was sort of indicative that he was a criminal, that he was a rebel according to the law. Now, Absalom, verse 18, now Absalom in his lifetime, while Absalom was alive, that is, had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is in the King's Valley. Now, the King's Valley in Jerusalem, also called the Valley of Jehoshaphat, also called the Kidron Valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it is called Absalom's monument. I pointed out a couple weeks ago, it bears repeating, it's interesting that Absalom said, I have no sons, when a few chapters before says he had 3 sons and 1 daughter named Tamar. He named his daughter after his sister who had been raped by Amnon. But eventually he had no sons. Somehow they were killed, perhaps in the coup, in the rebellion, but he had no one to pass his lineage on to by the time he built this monument. And so usually monuments are built by people who love you. Children, grandchildren, friends, people in the city who know your reputation. This guy builds his own monument, thinking, nobody's going to remember me. Well, actually, they do remember you, Absalom, but for all the wrong reasons. Okay, so if you ever come with us to Israel, we'll show you in the Kidron Valley to this day, as you are on the temple area, and you come to the very base of that valley called the Kidron Valley, and it starts sloping up on the other side to the Mount of Olives. There's a series of 3 monuments. One is a very tall one, 52 feet high, conically shaped on top, solid stone, that is called Absalom's monument, or the Pillar of Absalom. Jewish parents or Jewish people, Orthodox Jews, in walking by that, always spit in that direction, remembering what Absalom did in rebelling against his father. And it started in the Middle Ages. They started doing it, and they do it up to this point. I'm told they still do this. They will bring their families out, their children out, especially if their children are disobedient. They'll take them on a field trip to Absalom's pillar, and they'll point it out, and they will go through the story. They'll throw a rock at the monument, and they'll say, now, let me tell you this story, because this is what happens to kids who are disrespectful to their parents. It becomes an object lesson, a field trip for Orthodox Jewish parents, even to this day. Here's what's interesting. It's called Absalom's Pillar, but it wasn't built till 1,000 years after Absalom. It was built during the Second Temple period. How do we know that? Because we look at the architecture, and we determine that it's Greco-Roman in its architecture. So it's a tomb of some kind, obviously for a very famous person. It was there probably at the time of Jesus. Jesus referred to the tombs of the prophets that you whitewash and adorn. It could be a reference to that. Some people think Herod Agrippa was buried there. We don't really know. It could be that Absalom's pillar was there at one time, fell over, and years later, this Greco-Roman tomb in the Second Temple period was built. But remind me next time we're in Israel, and I'll point it out to you. Called it Absalom's monument. Now, I mentioned that Absalom, unless you read that, you wouldn't think of Absalom's monument. I'm glad that's there so I can remember him. You remember him. But the reason you remember him is because of his life. And that is the monument you leave. The monument you leave, I mean, you can have any picture or anything on your tombstone you want or any adornment you like, but actually the monument we all leave is the monument of our life. And everybody at some point in the future will know what that life is. Things that you think are hidden come out. And so he's buried under some pile of rocks up north, but he had a monument built in his honor so people would remember his name. Then, verse 19, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. I don't expect you to remember him, but we did cover him a couple chapters back. He was the son of one of the priests. He was the messenger that would run back and forth to David to tell him the news of what was going on in Jerusalem with Ahithophel and the others. Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the news to the king of how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." Boy, he's excited to bring this message to King David. Enthusiastic. Joab said to him, "You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead." And why do you suppose Joab told him that? Well, he knew David. That's why. Remember when the Amalekite came from Mount Gilboa with news of Saul's death? David killed him, killed the Amalekite. Because the Amalekite bragged and said, "Yeah, there was Saul, and he leaned against the spear, he didn't die, and he begged me to kill him. I killed him." David said, "You did, huh?" So he killed the Amalekite. So Joab says, "You know what? You may not want to be the messenger today. Save that for another day. Hold that thought." So Joab said to the Cushite. Now, a Cushite is somebody from the Upper Nile region. Cush was Nubia, or a part of Ethiopia. So he's not an Israelite, he's a foreigner. So he thinks, I'm gonna use a foreigner for this message. I'm not gonna use one of my prized people. If the king kills him, he's more expendable. That's probably what Joab is thinking. So Joab said to the Cushite, "Go and tell the king what you have seen." So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. And here it is again, Ahimaaz. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite." And Joab said, "Why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready?" He presses. "But whatever happens," he said, "let me run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Running without a message. Man is very enthusiastic. He wants to run. He wants to do something, but he doesn't have all the information. I fear that there are people like that. Sometimes in the ministry, young men in the ministry, "Man, I want to run. I want to preach." You don't have a message. "Yeah, but I still want to run. I still want to preach. I really want to do it." And what happens if you run without a message or a calling? You will get burned out. You will get angry at the people you minister to. You will quit the ministry midstream because you had the enthusiasm, you wanted to run, but you lacked the message. You need information. You need to know things. When people ask you questions and press you about issues, you need to be equipped. In the prophecy of Jeremiah, the Lord said to the prophet Jeremiah about a group of prophets, he said, "I did not send them, neither did I command them, therefore they shall not profit this people at all." You will only profit people when you're sent by God and you have a message. But he wants to run, so he finally says, "Go ahead, just get out of here, run." So David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate. Again, this is the gate Mahanaim, that little town east of the Jordan River. To the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. The watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, "If he is alone, there's news in his mouth." And he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "There's another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings news." So the watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He's a good man. Must mean he comes with good news." And Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." Now you answer this, was all well? All was not well. But that's his message. All is well, man. And he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, "Blessed be the Lord." He's just into this. "Your God, who delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" There's one question. And Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about." See, he really doesn't, he lacks information. He gets asked a question, he can't really answer it. Something happened. I don't know what it was, but it was something. Because it was just a big fuss. But all is well. So the king said, "Turn aside. Go over there. Stand in the corner." So he turned aside and he stood still. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do you harm be as that young man is." In other words, he's dead. Then the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, my son. If only I had died in your place, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." You know, we read this story and we can't help but think a few chapters back, it would have been so good if David would have invited his son early on and said, "Son, a lot of water under this bridge. Let's put the past behind us. Let's reconcile." I've stood in too many emergency rooms and places where people get notified about the death of a loved one, only to have nothing but sheer agony and remorse because they never got to say their piece and reconcile. That something was between them, some argument that divided them. And some point of pride that kept that person away from making the initiative and saying, "I love you, I forgive you." Now it's too late. Now forever they're going to have to deal with that guilt. And I know about this because I watched when my brother died and my brother and my father were estranged, and how my father handled that kind of grief, was eaten up by it, chewed up by it. And it took years for him to get past that. I don't think he ever did get past that because he was estranged from his own son. So here's that kind of grief. If only I had died in your place. I do think that David is dealing with guilt for his own sins of the past. And it's an interesting thing about guilt. When you are guilty because you've done something, subconsciously, you know you should be punished for it. And if you're not, it messes with you. So remember, Nathan the prophet said to David, "You're forgiven, but you're going to pay a price in your own family." And he did pay a price, but he just is swallowed up, I think, by the guilt of his past. And subconsciously, I think he felt he should bear some kind of punishment. I remember as a child, whenever I did something wrong, I had good parents who believed that the guilt complex in a child should be dealt with. And my dad was very faithful in handling my guilt complex and administering good psychological tactics in the right place, my rear end. And I never had a problem with guilt, because when I did something wrong, there was punishment, and I felt it. And it was good for me. And I distinctly remember when I was older, I did something that offended him, and I stood in front of him, and he just said, "You broke my heart." But he didn't administer any punishment, and I longed for it. I remember saying, just get it over with. Just let's deal with it that way. But it never came. And I think David is just eaten up by that kind of guilt. It's consuming him. And Joab was told, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard it and said that day, "The king is grieved for his son." And the people stole back into the city that day as people who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. In other words, they're walking on eggshells. They're just, don't say anything. Just, they're ashamed. They're acting as if they lost the battle. But the king covered his face. The king cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son, Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." There are stages of grief, as most of you well know. When there's a tragic loss, immediately there's denial. That's usually the first stage. No, it couldn't have happened. No, you're mistaken. Tell me it's not true. Second, anger. Who did this? Whose fault is it? Or I'm angry at myself. Guilt is part of it. Usually I'm guilty. I should have, I could have. Why didn't I? Followed by depression, eventually followed by hope. Those are the stages typically of grief. David is in the stage of denial and anger. It's understandable, certainly, but as a king during this time, not good, as you'll see. Let's try to finish that up. Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, "Today you have disgraced all your servants who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives, the lives of your concubines, in that you love your enemies and hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants, for today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, then it would have pleased you well." Grief is understandable, and on this day, we completely get it. But let me play this out over time. Some people get swallowed up and even consumed by grief to the detriment of others around him or her, and often other sons and daughters in the family. That one that is lost, you only want to talk about that one, and the picture's up, and it's understandable for a while, but after a while, the other kids are going, "Okay, so you never seem to make anything about us. It's always about the one that's gone." And it can be detrimental in a family over the long haul. My mother did not deal well with the death of my brother. She kind of did the opposite of what people do in grief. She took out all the pictures of him, all the reminders, all of his stuff. If you walked into the house, you would never find a shred of evidence that I even had a brother. And my aunt came one day and said, "Agnes, where's Bob's picture?" "Oh, I can't have it up. It's too painful." She said, "You must have it up. He's your son. He's your husband's son. He's Skip's brother and Rick and Jim's brother. You must have it up. You need to honor his memory. And though it is painful, you need to work through the pain." And it was the best advice we could ever get. Changed the way my mother handled that loss from that day forward. But this is early on. David is understandably torn by this. But Joab understands this is a very crucial moment for the nation. So, verse 7, now therefore arise, go out and speak comfort to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not one will stay with you this night. And that will be worse for you than all the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now. You think it's bad? It's been bad up to this point? You ain't seen nothing yet. And the king arose and sat in the gate. And they told all the people, saying, there's the king sitting in the gate, back to business. And so all the people came before the king, for every one of Israel fled to his tent. Now, in this instance, Joab is right. Proverbs 27, faithful are the wounds of a friend, the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. A friend stabs you in the front, an enemy will stab you in the back. A friend will come in and confront you eye to eye and say, okay, David, here's the skinny. You're going to lose everybody, because they feel like, here they have fought for you, and you are more interested in the loss of your young one, the young man Absalom, than over all that they have sacrificed for you. And it'll be far worse. At this point, Joab understood they don't need a crybaby as a leader. They need a strong person to deal with the nation in a strong way. There is a time to mourn, but don't do it this way in front of the people. You'll alienate them. So all the people were in dispute throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, the king saved us from the hand of our enemies. He delivered us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he has fled from the land because of Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, has died in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing back the king? Then King David said to Zadok and Abiathar the priest, saying, speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are you the last to bring the king back to his house, that is in Jerusalem, since the words of all Israel have come to the king, even to his house? You are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then are you the last to bring back the king? It's a good question. He says to the people in Jerusalem, why don't you bring the king back? Actually, that's a good question for a lot of churches. Why don't you bring the king back? Why don't you make it about Jesus again? I love that we're doing a series on Sunday, Always Only Jesus. I love that we're making much of Jesus every weekend for a period of time in this great book of Colossians. But we should always bring the king, make much of Jesus. It's not about us and our little feelings and this and that. All that's important to him. He can handle it. But we exist for his pleasure, it says in Revelation, for his purpose. Bring the king back. Enthrone the king. Worship the king. And say to Amasa, now get this. Say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? David and Amasa were relatives, but watch this. God do so to me and more, if you are not the commander of the army before me continually in the place of Joab. So keep this in mind, because Joab is going to remember this. And don't you know that this guy Amasa will be targeted by Joab later on? You'll see it. Why does David do this? Well, remember Amasa was the guy who was in Jerusalem who became the commander of the forces of Absalom because Joab went with David. Now, because I think David is really sore, angry, soured at Joab for disobeying his orders with Absalom, he says to Amasa, oh, and by the way, you who rebelled against me and became the commander on Absalom's army, you're going to be my new commander, my new general. Now, this blew everybody's mind. It was not what they expected. But do you realize when our King Jesus comes back, he is going to reward us with the most awesome, most unusual rewards, So much so that we were going to rule and reign with him, the Bible says, in his kingdom. Now, God loved us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And then when the king comes back, he's going to reward us who were once his enemies. He's going to reward us with incredible rewards and a place to rule and reign with him. So, you're going to be in charge, even though you led the rebellion. I'm going to be generous to you. And he swayed, verse 14, as a result, he swayed the hearts of all the men of Judah, just as the heart of one man, so that they sent this word to the king, return you and all your servants. Come on back to Jerusalem. And the king returned and came to the Jordan. By the way, I love seeing this kind of restoration when somebody who has been against you, if you can win his heart and give him a position, it's such a testimony to God's love, if it can be done. It's wonderful. So the king returned, came to the Jordan. Judah came to Gilgal to go and meet the king, to escort the king across the Jordan. Remember, so he's on the other side of the Jordan. Now they're coming to the Jordan River, crossing the Jordan River, going back up the hill to Jerusalem. But it says Judah, or the representatives probably, came to Gilgal to meet the king, to escort the king across the Jordan. Okay, really quickly. Gilgal was the place when the children of Israel came to the wilderness. Joshua took them across the Jordan. The first battle they fought was Jericho. But they encamped in front of Jericho at a place Joshua named Gilgal, which means to roll away, because they said, God has rolled away our reproach. So it became a very important piece of their history. Also, it was the place that King Saul is anointed as the king, the very first king, at Gilgal. So he's coming across to the very important place, Gilgal. Israel is there to meet him. And verse 16, Shimei, remember that guy who was throwing rocks in the air and dust and cursing the king last time when he was going out of town? The son of Gera, a Benjamite, who was from Bahurim, hastened and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. There were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons. Remember, Ziba was the guy who said, Mephibosheth, he doesn't care about you, and he lied to him. In verse 18, the ferry boat went across to carry over the king's household and to do what he thought was good. Now, Shimei, the son of Gera, that's that foul-mouthed Benjamite, fell down before the king when he had crossed the Jordan. And he said to the king, do not let my lord impute iniquity to me. When he cursed David and when he was leaving town, he thought, I'm never going to see David. David's in the rearview mirror. He's never coming back. David goes, I'm back. And so this guy's shaking in his little Israeli boots. He goes, don't let the Lord my Lord impute iniquity to me, or remember what wrong your servant did on the day that my Lord the king left Jerusalem, that the king should take it to heart. I was just joking. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned. Therefore, here I am, the first to come today of all the house of Joseph, to go down to meet my Lord the king. But Abishai, now do you remember the story? Abishai, when Shimei was cussing out David, Abishai said, let me go over and take his head off. David said, oh, stop it. So here he is again, Abishai. The son of Zeruiah answered and said, shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? David said, what do I have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should be adversaries to me today? Shall any man be put to death today in Israel? For do I not know that today I am king over Israel? Therefore the king said to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king swore to him. It sounds very gracious of David, but it's not really. Because And you'll read about it, so remember this. By the time we get to 1 Kings chapter 2, when David's son Solomon is the king, and David's on his deathbed, he goes, Solomon, come here. Before I die, a couple things. And one, that character, Shimei. He cussed me out. He threw rocks at me. I forgave him. I didn't take his head off. I told him that I wouldn't kill him. When I came back, I didn't. But may God give you wisdom. You handle him as you see fit. But then he added this, but don't bring his gray head down to the grave in peace. In other words, you may want to kill him. So, yeah, it sounds like forgiveness, but it's not really full forgiveness. And sometimes we forgive that way. Oh, I forgive you, but I'll never forget. Well, that's not forgiveness. That's burying the hatchet, but keeping the handle exposed in case you need it next week. To forgive is to walk away and never handle it and deal with it again. So David said, yeah, I forgive you. Sort of. Now, when Solomon is the king, he will tell Shimei, tell you what, I'll work a deal with you. I'll keep you alive as long as you stay in the environment of Jerusalem. But if I hear that you leave town, I'm going to hunt you down and kill you. You are quarantined to this city. Deal? Deal. But one day, a couple of his servants ran away, so he chased them, and it was told Solomon, that guy that you quarantined, he's out chasing these people down. So Solomon brought it back and said, now, we had an understanding, right? You wouldn't go, and if you went, I'd kill you. So in true mafioso form, it's like the Godfather brings people in and goes, so now I made you an offer you can't refuse. I'm going to kill you. So he kills them. And that's the end of Shimei. He will be dead. Now verse 24. I don't know if we can finish this. It's a long chapter. Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. So let me kind of sum this up. Ziba, who kept Mephibosheth, had come to David when David was leaving, saying, well, Mephibosheth didn't come because he wants to be the next king. He thinks that the kingdom's going to come back to him. That was a lie. Now Mephibosheth shows up. David says, okay, Phoebe, why didn't you come? Ziba said that, you were waiting for the kingdom to come to you. He goes, that's not true. I've been slandered. It's a lie. And so what the king does to Mephibosheth and Ziba is like he didn't know who to believe. Ziba said one thing, Mephibosheth said another. So he just said, tell you what, I took all the land that I restored to you. I'll give it back to you and to Ziba. You guys can split it. Mephibosheth said, I don't want any of the land. I'm happy just to be in your presence again. Ziba, my servant, can have it all. Which makes me believe Mephibosheth's story, not Ziba. And then verse 31, Barzillai the Gileadite came down from Rogelim and went across the Jordan with the king to escort him across the Jordan. Now this guy was a wealthy man who had taken care of David when he fled the country. Now he's coming back, but notice he's really old, verse 32. He's 80 years old, and he provided the king with supplies while he stayed at Mahanaim. He was a very rich man. The king said to Barzillai, come with me, I'll provide for you while you're in Jerusalem. And basically he said, look, I'm an old codger. I'm not going to go pull up my roots here. I got everything I need here. I don't want to make the journey. Let me die in peace here and be buried. And so David said, fine. But Barzillai said, tell you what, take another guy in my place, a guy by the name, verse 38, of Chimham. These are odd names. Chimham is how you'd pronounce it. So the king turned to Chim and said, okay, good, come on, I'll take care of you. Probably that was Barzillai's son. And so he said, look, I'll take care of him. I want to make good for your family. So now there's a quarrel. And it's about the kingdom. And the next paragraph, verse 40 through the end of the chapter. We're going to save till next time and let that be part of the next block, because after David, who's the king? Anybody know? Solomon. See, you're Bible scholars, you know that. Solomon. Okay, this is a little harder. Who's king after Solomon? Who's the king in Judah after Solomon? Rehoboam. Okay, but there's another guy named Jeroboam, and the kingdom does get split. I heard somebody say split kingdom. So this split between north and south, the fissure begins in the next paragraph. During the reign of David, before his death, before Solomon's reign, before the whole Jeroboam, Rehoboam, Hatfield and McCoy thing. So we'll get to that next time when we continue the story, but Absalom is now dead, and David can sadly, with that hole in his life, move on with his kingdom, and soon the book will come to a close. But Father, thank you for the opportunity to gather. Thank you for the opportunity to go through these large swaths of Scripture to get the historical narrative, because we are devoted to the apostles' doctrine. And we know that the apostles, whether they're Peter or Paul or Matthew or any of them, when they wrote their letters and they wrote their gospels, they often made reference to David and the covenant and the life of David. So they understood the very narrative over which we are examining and pouring ourselves. Lord, I pray that we will take some of these principles of grief, principles of forgiveness, principles of discipline in our own lives, Lord, that transcend time. And Lord, we would see these exercised in our own life for your glory and for the sake of the next generation. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's all stand.
For more resources from Calvary Church and Skip Heitzig, visit calvarynm.church. Thank you for joining us from this teaching in our series, Expound.